In the quiet chamber of the skull, where thoughts unfurl like wisps of smoke, there is a particular suffering. It is not the laceration of flesh, nor the gnawing pangs of hunger, but a silence, profound and pervasive, that echoes a deeper ache. This silence is often mistaken for solitude, for a self-imposed exile from the clamor of the world. Yet, it is a burden carried, a story untold, a scream swallowed before it ever reaches the air. We learn to live with this invisible weight, to navigate the crowded spaces of existence as if unburdened, our smiles a fragile veneer over the tumultuous currents beneath. The revelation, if one can call it that, is not in discovering a cure for this quiet malady, but in recognizing its very presence, in acknowledging the unspoken lexicon of our internal strife. To suffer in silence is to deny the essential human need for resonance, for the mirrored gaze that affirms one's existence, one's pain. It is to build a fortress around the fragile self, brick by painstaking brick, until the only view is inward, and the only sound is the drumming of a solitary heart. The wisdom perhaps lies not in escaping this suffering, but in dismantling the walls, in daring to let the silent scream find its voice, even if it is only a whisper into the vast, indifferent void. For in that act of articulation, however small, lies the first tremor of release, the faint echo of a connection waiting to be made. The invitation, often subtle, sometimes stark, is to cease the ceaseless performance. We are architects of our own masks, meticulously crafting facades of resilience, indifference, or even joy, while a subterranean river of anguish carves its hidden path. This sustained masquerade, however, exacts a heavy toll. It demands a perpetual expenditure of energy, a constant vigilance against the crack that might expose the raw, quivering nerve beneath. The wisdom, or perhaps the poignant truth, is that the very act of concealing, of holding the suffering hostage within the confines of the self, amplifies its power. It grants the unspoken pain a monstrous authority, allowing it to fester, to warp perception, to silence the faint echoes of authentic connection. To reveal, in this context, is not to broadcast one's wounds to the world, seeking solace in universal commiseration. Rather, it is an internal dismantling, a gentle unraveling of the self-imposed bindings. It is the courageous act of acknowledging the internal landscape, however desolate, without immediate judgment, or the desperate need for alteration. This act of recognition, of granting permission for the unacknowledged to simply be, is the first breath of genuine freedom. It is the subtle shift from being a prisoner of silence to becoming its reluctant, yet eventually liberating observer. The paradox lies in the very nature of seeking an end to suffering. We are conditioned to believe that discomfort is an aberration, a flaw to be corrected, a problem to be solved. Yet, the deep undercurrent of existence suggests otherwise. The silent suffering, often rooted in an inherent sense of separation or incompleteness, cannot be eradicated by mere intellectual pronouncements or the adoption of new philosophies. It is not an enemy to be vanquished, but a shadow to be acknowledged, a fundamental aspect of the human condition. The yearning for its cessation often becomes another layer of suffering, a desperate clinging to a utopian ideal of perpetual tranquility. To reveal here is not to find a magic switch, but to turn the gaze inward with a terrifying honesty. It is to observe the mechanisms of our own internal resistance, the subtle ways we perpetuate our own quiet agony by refusing to meet it directly. The silence, then, is not merely an absence of sound, but a profound refusal to listen to the whispers of our own soul. The path, if there is one, is not out of the suffering, but deeper into its texture, to feel its contours without flinching, to understand its language without judgment. Only then, when the desperate struggle against what is begins to subside, can the grip of silent anguish loosen, not by force, but by a gentle dissolution born of acceptance. The weight of the unexpressed is not merely a psychological burden. It manifests in the very fabric of our being. It constricts the breath, tenses the shoulders, and clouds the clarity of sight. This silent suffering, often born from a primal fear of judgment or rejection, becomes a self-imposed prison. We believe that by shielding our vulnerability, we are protecting ourselves, when in reality we are suffocating the very essence of our capacity for connection. The insight, then, is not found in seeking external validation or a sympathetic ear, but in the internal process of disentanglement. It's about recognizing that the silence we maintain is a choice, however unconscious, and that the narrative we construct around our pain, that it is uniquely ours, that it is too profound or too shameful to share, is often a fabrication of the mind's protective mechanisms. To reveal in this context is to bring light to these internal machinations, to observe how we become complicit in our own isolation. It is a slow, often painful process of peeling back layers of defense, not to expose a raw wound, but to understand the architecture of its containment. The true liberation begins when the fear of exposure is outweighed by the exhaustion of concealment, when the desire for authentic existence supersedes the comfort of the familiar, suffocating silence. The concept of revelation often conjures images of grand epiphanies, sudden flashes of understanding that dissolve all doubt. Yet in the context of silent suffering, the unveiling is rarely so dramatic. It is more akin to the slow, painstaking process of archaeology, carefully brushing away layers of sediment to reveal what has long been buried. The suffering itself is not the enemy. It is the resistance to it, the fervent desire for its immediate cessation that binds us. We are taught to fix, to mend, to escape what feels uncomfortable. This relentless pursuit of peace, this avoidance of the inner turmoil, paradoxically perpetuates the very silence we yearn to break. The insight, then, is to see that the silent suffering isn't something happening to us, but rather a manifestation of our deeply ingrained patterns of avoidance. It is a reflection of the stories we tell ourselves about what we should feel, what we should express, and what we must conceal. To reveal, therefore, is not about finding an external solution or a profound philosophical decree. It is about a quiet, internal turning, a willingness to sit with the discomfort, to listen to its unspoken language, and to allow its presence without immediate judgment or the desperate need for its removal. This radical acceptance, this quiet surrender to the truth of the moment, begins the slow, arduous process of loosening the grip of silence. It is in this non-resistance that the first echoes of freedom begin to resonate, not as an absence of pain, but as a deeper understanding of its transient nature. The very act of seeking to stop suffering often entrenches it. This silent agony isn't a foreign intruder. It's a profound, if unwelcome, guest that arrives when we refuse to listen to the nuances of our own being. We spend immense energy constructing elaborate mental edifices, fortifications against the perceived assault of discomfort. This internal struggle, the constant push against what is, becomes the crucible of our deepest unspoken pain. The revelation is not a technique to quiet the mind or a philosophy to adopt, but a radical shift in perspective. It's about dismantling the internal machinery of resistance, not through brute force, but through a gentle, yet unwavering observation. To reveal here is to become the patient observer of your own internal landscape, without the urge to immediately prune or cultivate. It's to notice the fear that grips the throat, the tension that tightens the chest, the narrative that whispers of inadequacy, and to allow it all to simply be. This is not an act of surrender in the sense of defeat, but of surrender in the sense of releasing control, of letting go of the desperate need to orchestrate every internal experience. In this profound quietude of acceptance, the silent suffering, no longer fueled by resistance, begins to lose its suffocating grip. It is not banished, but transformed. Its weight lessens, and its true nature, as a messenger, not a master, begins to emerge. The relentless search for meaning, for understanding, often traps us deeper within the confines of silent suffering. We believe that if we can just intellectualize our pain, categorize it, or trace its origins, we might finally transcend it. Yet the very act of dissecting the wound keeps it from healing. The revelation here is not in finding the why, but in dissolving the illusion of separation. We are not discrete entities experiencing suffering as an external event. Rather, suffering is interwoven with the fabric of existence, a fundamental chord in the symphony of being. To reveal in this context is to see through the ego's persistent narrative of self-importance and self-pity. It is to recognize that the unique burden we feel is, in essence, a variation on a universal theme. The quiet anguish we carry is not a personal failing but a testament to our capacity for depth, for feeling. The path out of this self-imposed silence is not to silence the suffering itself, but to silence the incessant commentary about the suffering. It's about disengaging from the internal debate, the endless rumination that feeds the quiet despair. When the mind ceases its frantic attempts to control or eliminate the pain, when the resistance softens, a space opens. In this space, the suffering is not eradicated, but its oppressive weight diminishes, replaced by a profound, if sometimes melancholic, acceptance of what simply is. The quiet agony we carry, the unspoken burdens that settle deep within, are not always an indication of something broken within us. Often they are the echoes of a fragmented world, a reflection of the collective unease that permeates our modern existence. We internalize the discord, the fear, the relentless striving, believing it to be a personal failing rather than a shared human experience. This internalization fuels the silence, fostering the belief that our struggles are unique, isolating us further in a sea of unspoken despair. The revelation, then, is not in finding a singular truth or a definitive answer to suffering, but in recognizing the interconnectedness of our silent battles. It's about seeing that the individual ache is a note within a larger, melancholic symphony. To reveal is to dissolve the illusion of self-sufficiency, to understand that genuine healing rarely occurs in isolation. It is a slow, arduous process of dismantling the ego's fortress, not by force but by the gradual softening of its rigid defenses. When we cease to view our suffering as a personal flaw to be hidden, and instead see it as a shared human condition, the suffocating grip of silence begins to loosen. The path forward is not about eradicating the pain, but about finding a new relationship with it, one rooted in radical acceptance and a profound, if sometimes unsettling, empathy for the universal human struggle. The attempt to control experience, to dictate what should be felt and what must be suppressed, is the very engine of silent suffering. We are masters of internal editing, constantly filtering and refining our emotional landscape to present a version of ourselves we deem acceptable, even to ourselves. This self-censorship, however, creates a chasm between who we are and who we pretend to be, and it is in this chasm that the quiet anguish resides. We cling to the illusion that if we simply push down the discomfort, it will dissipate, much like holding a beach ball underwater. Yet the pressure only builds unseen, until it threatens to erupt. The revelation here is not about finding a method to silence the suffering, but about silencing the controller of suffering. It's about recognizing the futility of trying to manage the unmanageable, of attempting to intellectualize or force away the raw, visceral experience of being human. To reveal is to simply let go of the reins, to allow the full spectrum of emotion to flow without judgment or intervention. It's a terrifying surrender, a willingness to be utterly vulnerable to the inner tempest, knowing that true peace is not the absence of storm, but the ability to dance within it. When the internal battle ceases, when the desperate struggle for control is abandoned, the silent suffering no longer resisted begins to transform, not into joy, but into a profound and quiet acceptance. The very architecture of the self, as we perceive it, often becomes the framework for our silent suffering. We construct an identity, a collection of stories, beliefs, and roles, and then fiercely defend this construct against any perceived threat. The pain we carry in silence is often the consequence of a disparity between this carefully curated self and the raw, unedited reality of our experience. We learn to suppress emotions, to deny inconvenient truths, all in service of maintaining a coherent, acceptable self-image. This act of self-deception, however subtle, breeds a profound isolation, a sense that we are perpetually living behind a veil. The revelation here is not about discarding the self, but about understanding its fluid and impermanent nature. It's about seeing that the I that suffers in silence is not a fixed entity, but a constantly shifting constellation of thoughts, feelings, and sensations. To reveal is to simply observe this process without attachment, to witness the ego's machinations without buying into its narratives of lack or inadequacy. It's about dissolving the rigid boundaries we've erected, allowing the suppressed emotions to surface, not as enemies but as transient visitors. When the frantic clinging to a fixed self begins to loosen, the silent suffering, no longer anchored by rigid identification, begins to soften, allowing for a deeper, more expansive experience of being. The very notion of revealing implies a hidden truth, a secret kept. Yet in the realm of silent suffering, what is hidden is often not a singular event, but a pervasive pattern of self-denial. We are adept at convincing ourselves that the uncomfortable sensations, the gnawing anxieties, the profound sadness, are isolated incidents, fleeting moments that will pass if ignored. This deliberate ignorance, however, is a form of active participation in our own quiet agony. It is a refusal to engage with the raw material of our inner lives, preferring the deceptive comfort of numbness. The true revelation, then, is to see that the silence isn't a passive state but a sustained effort, a continuous act of suppression. It's about witnessing the internal mechanisms we employ to push away what feels threatening, to rationalize what feels wrong, to intellectualize what demands feeling. To reveal is not to find a profound answer, but to abandon the desperate search for one. It's about turning towards the discomfort, not with the intention to fix it, but simply to observe its presence without judgment. When the relentless striving to not feel begins to subside, when the internal resistance softens, the silent suffering, no longer fueled by our efforts to escape it, begins to transform. It is in this unadorned presence, with what is that a different kind of freedom, a deeper acceptance, subtly emerges. The incessant chatter of the mind, often perceived as a tool for understanding and control, can become the very mechanism that perpetuates silent suffering. We analyze, we categorize, we ruminate, believing that if we just think about our pain enough, we might eventually dissect it into oblivion. Yet this mental noise, far from offering liberation, frequently drowns out the subtle whispers of our own intuitive wisdom, trapping us in a cycle of intellectualized agony. The silence we yearn to break is not merely an external absence of sound, but an internal cacophony of judgment and self-criticism. The revelation here is not about silencing the mind entirely, an impossible feat, but about changing our relationship to its relentless stream of thoughts. It's about recognizing that thinking about suffering is not the same as experiencing it directly. To reveal is to step back from the mental drama, to observe the thoughts as they arise and pass, without engaging with their content or allowing them to dictate our emotional state. This detachment is not indifference, but a profound act of self-compassion, allowing the raw experience of pain to simply be, unadulterated by narrative and judgment. When the mind's grip loosens, when the desperate need to understand or control diminishes, the silent suffering, no longer fed by internal conflict, begins to recede, leaving behind a quiet space for genuine presence. The silent suffering often finds its roots in the stories we tell ourselves about our own inadequacy. We are taught, implicitly and explicitly, that certain emotions are undesirable, certain vulnerabilities are weaknesses to be overcome. This conditioning leads us to suppress vast swathes of our inner experience, creating a disjunction between who we truly are and the idealized self we strive to present. The pain, then, is not merely the presence of discomfort, but the internal conflict born from this continuous act of self-rejection. We silently bear the burden of not measuring up, of falling short of an unattainable ideal. The revelation, in this sense, is an act of profound self-compassion. It is the courageous decision to dismantle the critical inner voice, to challenge the narratives of unworthiness that have long held us captive. To reveal is to cease fighting with what is, to embrace the full spectrum of our humanity, imperfections and all. It's about recognizing that the silence we maintain is a fortress built not to protect us from the world, but from our own authentic selves. When the desperate need for perfection loosens its grip, when the judgment of our own emotional landscape softens, the silent suffering, no longer fueled by self-condemnation, begins to dissolve, allowing for a genuine, if sometimes raw, connection with the truth of our being. The profound burden of silent suffering often stems from our relentless pursuit of answers. We believe that if we can just intellectualize our pain, trace its origins, or label its essence, we will somehow gain control over it. Yet, this very quest for definition frequently traps us in a perpetual loop of analysis, distancing us from the raw, lived experience of the moment. The silence we carry is not merely the absence of a voice, but the internal stifling of genuine inquiry, replaced by a desperate need for resolution. The revelation, then, is not in finding the ultimate solution, but in abandoning the illusion that one exists. It's about recognizing that suffering, in its most fundamental form, is an intrinsic part of existence, an ebb and flow that defies constant categorization or permanent eradication. To reveal is to simply be with the discomfort, without the frantic mental gymnastics of trying to fix, understand, or escape it. This is a radical act of surrender, not to defeat, but to the truth of the present moment. When the mind ceases its relentless pursuit of an end to what is, when the internal struggle against reality softens, the silent suffering, no longer fueled by resistance, begins to transform. It is not banished but integrated, allowing for a deeper, more profound connection to the full spectrum of being. The very structure of our expectations can become the silent architect of our suffering. We cling to ideals of perpetual happiness, effortless success, and unblemished peace, measuring our reality against these unattainable benchmarks. When life, in its messy truth, inevitably deviates, the dissonance creates a silent internal conflict, a gnawing sense of failure that we rarely voice. This unspoken disappointment, this quiet disillusionment, becomes a heavy cloak, insulating us from genuine experience and authentic connection. We suffer in silence not because we are inherently flawed, but because we refuse to grant ourselves permission to simply be with the unfolding of life as it is, not as we wish it to be. The revelation, then, is a profound act of letting go. It's about dismantling the rigid blueprints of expectation, acknowledging that the path of existence is winding, unpredictable, and often steeped in a beauty that emerges from its very imperfections. To reveal is not to eradicate the yearning for something more, but to embrace the fullness of what is present, including the discomfort, the uncertainty, and the quiet ache. When we cease to wage war against reality, when the desperate struggle to align our lives with an imagined ideal finally subsides, the silent suffering, no longer fueled by resistance, begins to transform. It is not banished but softened, allowing for a deeper, more profound acceptance of the intricate, often melancholic dance of life. The pervasive illusion of control is perhaps the deepest root of silent suffering. We are conditioned to believe that life is a problem to be solved, a series of challenges to be overcome by sheer force of will. This relentless striving, this continuous attempt to orchestrate outcomes and manipulate internal states, only deepens the chasm between our expectations and the untamed flow of existence. When reality inevitably deviates from our meticulously crafted plans, the unvoiced disappointment, the quiet despair of powerlessness settles in, becoming a heavy, unspoken burden. The revelation, therefore, is not about finding a magic lever to pull, but about a radical surrender to the inherent unpredictability of being. It's about recognizing the futility of clinging to rigid blueprints, of demanding that life conform to our narrow conceptions of what it should be. To reveal is to simply let go of the reins, to allow the current of existence to carry us, even into uncomfortable waters, without constant resistance. When the desperate need to control diminishes, when the internal struggle against the unfolding moment finally ceases, the silent suffering, no longer fueled by our defiant grip, begins to dissipate. It is not an end to challenges, but a profound shift in how we meet them, moving from a posture of battle to one of quiet, unwavering acceptance.